Okay, welcome to this after talk hosted by Future Energy Hub at the University of Stavanger in collaboration with Syse Climate Investment. Today we have with us Dr. Ellen Quigley from the University of Cambridge, where she works at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk. Ellen, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to join us.
No problem at all. Glad to be here.
And thank you to you as well, Trond, for coming along for this after talk.
Thank you for having me.
So, before we go into the details of the topic you talked about today, could you give us a brief background of your career and also how you ended up studying existential risks?
Sure. So I actually studied English literature for my undergrad, but I became increasingly concerned about climate change in particular. So once I finished, I went home to my hometown, which is in the middle of Canada, Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and was a community organizer for several years. And in the meantime, kind of realized that I didn't know how the whole system worked. I didn't feel like I knew where the leverage points were, and I just felt like I wasn't making much of a difference. So I went back to university and I went to the UK, which kind of ended up accidentally leading me into learning about economics and finance, and I didn't even know enough about it at the time to know that they're actually quite different and separate areas of study, and that you can know actually a lot about one without knowing very much about the other. So that's how ignorant I was. And then I kind of gradually found my way into sustainable finance because I have felt as though that's where some of the biggest levers are.
That's cool. And also we just found out, because when I was just researching yesterday, because I found out that you would join our after talk, I just went to YouTube to just find out what your background was. And the first talk that came up was linked to some garlic growing in Saskatoon. And also, Trond, you have actually been studying there for half a year.
Yeah, so I thought it was quite random that you're from Saskatoon. It's a nice city. Yeah.
Because that's quite a small place, isn't it?
Yeah.
So it's a small
world. And very cold place, but the sun is always shining.
Yes, it's pretty funny.
I think, is that like the brand of the city? Is that the sun shining state or something? Or is that another state?
Somewhere in the US. We say we're the land of the living skies. Because
living skies. So that, yeah.
Okay. So just for our listeners or watchers that haven't got a chance to watch the talk you gave today at Driva, which I, by the way, highly recommend. You can find it at YouTube in Syse's YouTube channel. So could you give like a very brief wrap up of the topics you handled in that talk?
Sure. And, I think a lot of what I covered is, some of the stuff that we've all been noticing in this strange time we're living through. The extent to which, COVID-19 has revealed all of these system-wide risks in our society, in our economies, in our financial systems. So I was just kind of drawing some of those together and explaining their links to something called universal ownership theory, which is the idea that if you are a large long-term investor, like the Sovereign Wealth Fund in Norway, then you have an interest in the health and performance of the entire market, and of the people and the economy and the natural world on which all of that relies. So basically, the idea is that if you have a large portfolio, like the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, if one company is polluting and paying its workers poorly, that the costs of that will get picked up elsewhere in the portfolio, because you will end up with all of these other costs associated with climate change, with pollution of the air and water. Unequal societies tend to struggle economically, and you want a robust middle class to have a healthy economy. And so on and so forth. So, if you're thinking as an investor that you should be looking at each company individually and trying to cut its costs, then you're really missing the big picture, because all of those cut costs end up adding a much greater cost to the whole system. And there are a lot of things like that, a lot of huge systemic risks that end up hurting everyone that can be prevented much more cheaply than they have to be, than the pile of expenditure to deal with the problems after they've already taken hold. Again, climate change is the perfect example of this. To prevent it costs very little compared to how much it would cost us all. And when I say cost, I also mean the human dimension, what it does to everyone all over the world, including in countries in the north, like Norway or like Canada, where I'm from. There will be tons of people who are forced to leave their homes, and that will destabilize people in the countries that they want to come to as well. And we're causing most of the trouble in countries like Canada and Norway and the UK, where I live, because we consume a lot more than other countries. And actually that often doesn't even show up in our national accounting, because we don't take account of the emissions of the products that we bring into the country, and those emissions are counted against China or Vietnam, wherever the products were made. So we really have a huge responsibility here to reduce these systemic risks on behalf of everybody else.
Okay.
So it's basically a way of thinking that not just that company benefits and that company benefits. It's like the whole system gains, right?
Exactly.
So that's like a healthy economy. That's what you want to have, right? So
yeah.
Yeah.
And actually, just to elaborate slightly, if you look at what COVID-19 has done, if you don't treat workers properly and you don't allow for paid sick days, we're going to find out after all of this happened, the extent to which people who felt like they had to go to work, or they were going to get fired or not get paid, who went to work while sick with COVID-19 and spread it to other people, we're going to discover the extent to which, these kind of what we normally view as, human workers' rights violations. They're actually not just harmful for the worker, but for all of us. Like we can't isolate these risks anymore. They're all very much interlinked. And if you treat people and the planet poorly, it doesn't just hurt the individuals or the part of the planet that you're hurting. It hurts the whole system.
Okay, so just to take one step back, you talk about both systemic risks and existential risks, and we also have the normal term risks. What are the difference between these types of risks? Do you have a quick explanation for that?
Sure, yes. And so I worked in the Center for the Study of Existential Risk, at Cambridge. And what we are referring to when we talk about existential risks are risks that can basically kill us all. Or risks.
Any examples of that?
So climate change is arguably an existential risk, because we could actually get into a hothouse planet that can't support human life, or at least human civilization. So often an existential risk will refer to not just the extinction of humans, but basically the collapse of civilization, of any viable civilization. So according to that definition, climate change counts. So do really crazy things like, asteroid strikes or nuclear war. Sadly, not as unlikely as we would hope. Pandemics actually are one of the things that we study, which is kind of funny now. And also other sorts of bio risks. So there are a lot of things that can kill us all, including artificial intelligence. So the singularity.
So that's very interesting. I've read Nick Bostrom has a book about that, and also a guy called Sam Harris has discussed it a lot in his podcast. So yeah, that's an interesting topic as well. But it seems to be like some people argue that no, it's no problem at all, while others are really scared of artificial intelligence.
Yeah, I personally am more scared about climate change.
Elon Musk is also quite, skeptical towards artificial intelligence, or he's using it, but he says also that it can kill us all. So it's quite interesting.
Yeah. There's a big debate on that. Yeah.
So neither me nor Helleik has studied finance or economics, so we're not really used to some of the terms that you had in your talk. So you talked about quite a bit about alpha and beta, and have I understood correctly that it's two types of portfolios that are, well, okay, I can see that you're you want to answer that?
So basically, alpha and beta describe where your returns come from in the same portfolio.
Okay.
So, and I really should have explained this in my talk earlier, so apologies. But basically, beta just represents the performance of the whole financial system as a whole. It's the kind of market average. So if you were to track your portfolio against a benchmark or something, that would be sort of a measure of beta.
Like an index, for example, Tokyo
yes,
funds,
exactly.
like you have index funds following indexes linked to countries or industries.
Exactly. So that would be following the beta of that country, or following a kind of, global beta, I guess you could say. Whereas alpha is the extent to which your fund is outperforming the market. So is doing better than the market. And what I find funny about this debate about alpha and beta is if you talk to fund managers, they only think about alpha. Include actually asset owners as well. People talk about alpha all the time, but actually, if you look at academic studies, most of their returns come from beta.
When you average out like the different funds and you compare them to indexes, they don't really outperform on average, especially when you deduct the fees for running the fund.
Yes.
So
right.
they think they are cynical, but they're not really cynical, because it would be better to go for the greater good. Is that, can you say something like that?
Yeah, well, so I think about things very differently in this space. I think that, and this is highly controversial in the financial realm, trust me, but I think that alpha is kind of selfish. I think that it represents kind of individual competition among people that detracts from the performance of beta. And I view beta as our kind of common project, which is the health of the whole system itself. And I think we need to be talking a lot more about beta. And beta, by the way, is where all these systemic risks are that alpha is actually often contributing to. Because if you have, everyone trying to kind of get an edge, that's where you start to see the cost cutting and the kind of short-termism in the whole system. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so you're saying that the portfolios, like, they actually get more money from the beta and not the alpha.
Yes. Yeah.
But even though then they are still focusing on the alpha, right?
Yes, exactly.
But I guess this depends on how big a portfolio is. So I would just guess that if you have a lot of shares in a lot of different companies, then it makes more sense to prioritize beta, because it's the health of a system, right?
You would hope that, wouldn't you? But we actually still see it in a lot of very large funds. I'm not going to name any names, to be but and look, not everyone is the same here. And for example, your Norwegian sovereign wealth fund self-identifies as a universal owner, so they get that it's all about the system's health. That they're acknowledging that in identifying themselves that way, but it doesn't actually necessarily trickle down into how they behave. So just to be slightly controversial again, the exclusions of fossil fuel companies that the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund did, they restricted that just to their public equity portfolio. Just to explain a bit, public equity refers to these large companies that are listed on the stock market. But the thing is, once you're listed on the stock market, that's the secondary market. So, after a company ends up on the stock market, then they've already received all of the money that they were going to have from doing that. So like the moment you list, you get a bunch of money when people buy your shares. But then after that, the shares are just traded around by people, by investors, and the money doesn't go back to the company. So what matters much more is what happens in the bond portfolio. And Norway has an enormous bond portfolio, and they're still buying the bonds of the same companies that they decided to exclude. And that means that they're actually providing new financing to these companies that they've decided they wanted to get away from otherwise. So sometimes it doesn't trickle down. It doesn't kind of sink in.
Yeah, that's something I learned from your talk today, the difference between bonds and shares, because, I didn't know that before. And I just thought, okay, if I buy a share at the company that I think do anything well, like it's good for the environment or something like that, then, you know, that value of the company increases, but it's just the value of the share, right? So the company doesn't necessarily get that much more. So they can still do, or I guess I have a say, you know, if I buy a lot of shares, but, you know, the bonds have some obligations, or like how's the difference between, you know, influence? Like if I want to have a good influence on something with my money, you know, can you say something about that? The difference between bonds and shares?
Sure. So first of all, yeah, you're right. So if you buy shares in a company that you like that's already listed on the stock market, you aren't really helping them, actually, which is quite counterintuitive. But you're also not hurting a company whose shares you sell unless you announce it. And actually, you know, the fact that Norway announces its exclusions, that's where the effect is.
Yeah, because a lot of other people then would probably want to sell, and then the price goes down, right?
Well, okay, so...
Okay, sorry. You need to dumb it down.
There's a lot to unwrap here.
Yeah.
It's like a financial crash course while doing some talk on the topic.
Well, so first of all, you've got... I actually think the effect is mainly to do with reputation of the companies and shame. So there is some evidence that a colleague of mine here at Cambridge has pulled together. Her name is Baska Ata Darkoa. You should look up her work. She finds that there is a short-term hit to stock prices of companies that the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, because it's so large, like when it excludes, there's a small short-term effect on stock price, but that doesn't actually really affect the companies again, right? Because those shares are just traded among shareholders. But so I think it's mainly the actual announcement itself and the kind of shaming effect that it can have. Selling shares doesn't really affect share price too much. I don't think that's our way into changing the way the system works. What matters much more is where new capital comes from, and the vast majority of it comes from bank lending and bonds. And bonds are basically, like if you buy a bond, you're lending money to that company. So a lot of people think they can have much more of an effect on the public equity side because they can vote and so on. I'm sort of losing faith in that because a lot of the votes, almost all of the votes, are just advisory. They're not binding. And almost all of them are for disclosure instead of actual action. And so I'm starting to kind of lose faith in that, although I think we could start voting against the board members of these companies, which would start to scare them. And that's a power that we have not used much in recent years. But that said, I actually think it's more powerful if you're a bondholder and you say, you know, we're going to need you to align with the Paris Agreement before we buy any more of your bonds. That's what scares a company, because the fewer people who are willing to buy their bonds, the more expensive it is for them to raise money that way. Their cost of capital will actually go up, and there's some evidence of this as well. So there's an actual financial effect on them if fewer people are willing to lend money to them.
Okay, can I have a comment for? So if all you're saying is correct, because me and Trond had a discussion previously where we talked about what a person should do with their monthly savings, and Trond was shaming me for a bit because I put like a little bit of money into index funds every month and say you are contributing to keeping up the bad system. But if what you're saying is correct, that might not be the thing, especially if I work on the side trying to develop renewable energy systems. Or
so I would agree. I think it depends on who your index provider is, though.
It's a Norwegian bank, so I guess they are pretty high on like an ethical bank score list. So I think they take away the worst companies, hopefully.
Well, but it doesn't matter, arguably, according to what you're saying. I know it is so counterintuitive, but for a lot of people, it takes a while to kind of really fully absorb this. But actually, your Norwegian bank might actually go through another fund manager to provide the index. So it's actually pretty important to trace through all of these layers, and then to put pressure on not just your bank, but the fund manager, the ultimate fund manager, to ensure that they are at least voting your shares in the way that you want. And I can actually help you. There are some key shareholder resolutions to push them on, that sort of thing. But that's the way that you have an effect through an index fund. But don't worry what you own, about what you own. That's not so much the key as how you own it.
Okay. So I have a quick question. So talking about bonds and stocks and alpha and beta. So is it so that the platforms that are beta have a higher percentage of bonds versus stocks, so that they have, a bigger influence, or is that, have I misunderstood it?
I think I just didn't explain it well enough. So the beta is not referring to like a different pot of money or anything. Alpha and beta are just two ways of looking at where you're, like, what you can attribute your returns to. So beta, you're just saying, if you're saying that you generated blank amount of alpha, you're just saying that you did better than the market.
Yeah.
And people almost never talk about beta, but when they do talk about beta, they're just referring to how the whole market is doing. But I would love for there to be beta funds, actually, like beta-focused funds. Okay, so I should say there are beta-focused funds, but they're not looking at it in the same way that you guys and I would be. They're not looking to decrease systemic risk. They're just kind of acknowledging what you've said, which is that it's hard to outperform the market net of fees. So, but anyway, I think there need to be more funds that are focused on what they are contributing to the whole system.
Yeah. Okay, so this is all. Yeah. Before I see we are quickly running out of time, I guess we could discuss this topic for a long time, but we have some final questions that we'd like to round up this conversation. And one of them that I was thinking about watching a talk today, okay, she works at the Center for Existential Risk, and I was just wondering, how does working with these kind of really serious issues impact your outlook on society and also like life in general?
It's a really good question, but I think if you worry about climate change all the time anyway, it's actually better to be working on it alongside other people that don't think you're crazy for worrying about it so much.
Okay.
So I know that sounds strange, but I think my colleagues would say something similar. If for the colleagues, for example, who've been warning everybody about pandemics for a long time, and then one comes along, it makes you feel like you at least were working on something that was worthwhile. And that's important. If we're facing all of these really crazy things, we at least want to know that we're helping. And so I think there's something reassuring in that.
I think there could be one more reassuring point as well. I remember I read a book a few years ago by a guy called William B. Irwin about, I think it was called The Ancient Art of Stoic Joy. And there he tries to take the teachings of the ancient Stoic philosophers into the modern world. And one of the techniques he highlighted that you should do to improve your happiness and outlook of life, that is to briefly throughout your day to engage in what he calls negative visualizations. So say, for example, that you briefly visualize those kind of existential threats, like super volcanoes, or then you will gradually come to not take the world we live in for granted. And that was interesting to read because there is something to that. It's so easy to take life for granted, but that it could be swept away overnight. Then the next time you take your bicycle to work, you might enjoy it a bit more.
Maybe we are unwittingly being trained as Stoics in my office.
Maybe. Yeah, so that's interesting. So one more question. I think I picked this one up from a podcast. Maybe it was Tim Ferriss's podcast, but it's a really good question in my opinion, especially to someone like you that have a really successful career and is doing well. So the question goes as follows. So in the last 5 years, what kind of new belief, behavior, or habit has most improved your life?
Wow.
I guess maybe our listeners can learn from that. Do you have any?
Yeah,
Right.
I don't think of myself as so well. Okay, I mean, if I am successful, which I think is, you know, some people might disagree anyway. Then it's just because of you know, kind of feeling more and more confident in you know, my curiosity, not feeling this need to become or even targeting areas in which I'm not an expert and have so much more to learn. I think by following your curiosity as opposed to your actual strengths, I used to just do the things I was best at. And I think that's a huge limitation. You know, I still acknowledge there's so much I don't understand about finance and economics, and it will probably take me a lifetime to feel, well, no, I'll probably keep discovering more things I don't know, actually. And I think you need to, that requires some level of kind of brash confidence to just, you know, to try to build a career in an area in which you do just kind of constantly feel ignorant. And I suppose I've settled into that and felt much more comfortable with that in the last few years. And I think that's actually weirdly helped me to develop ideas that I definitely wouldn't have done if I had just, you know, gone the easy route.
Yeah, it's a nice answer. Thanks.
Yes, to be creative and then to, you know, try to learn more about the things that you don't really know too much about already.
Yeah, exactly. It's also more fun.
So, Trond, do you have any last questions you want to ask Ellen before we round this thing up?
No, I think I'm good.
What about you, Ellen? Anything we haven't covered?
No, I guess I would really like to encourage Norwegians to take a leadership role on this, because, you know, you're a very small country with a few million people. And I happen to know, you know, it's a tight community, and you know, you have a lot of connections in and amongst you, and you control an enormously influential pot of money. And I think that if you were to really make it a universal ownership fund, you could shift capital and you could shift social discourse within the whole investment industry. You know, we have no time. We need to cut emissions in half this decade. And, you know, if the Norwegian people made this happen, you know, it would reach its tentacles through the whole system. You could really have an impact on beta and on these enormous systemic risks. Just 5 million people in a world of 7 or 8 billion, you could really change things. So, you know, please do.
Yeah. And I guess that's, you know, exactly the intentions of Nysnø Klimainvesteringer, climate investment. So yeah. But we have this big pension fund, and maybe we have to do something about it. But yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you both for joining the after talk today. It was a pleasure to talk to you both, and yeah, have a nice rest of the evening.
Thank you very much. It was great to speak with you.
Bye.
Bye.